All right. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Nalule. And today our topic is going to be focused on energy access in Africa, specifically looking at the role of nuclear energy. So this webinar is part of our African Energy Transition book launch, because as you've noticed in the past few weeks, we've been holding different webinars by book contributors discussing their topics in the book. And today, Susan will be discussing her book chapter on nuclear energy, but however, she's going to be joined by Mr. Jeremy Odo and Ms. Imena from the Nuclear Energy Agency. So this is a special webinar because in most cases in Africa, we don't really pay a lot of attention to nuclear energy, but today we'll learn more about nuclear energy, and we also have an expert from the Nuclear Energy Agency who will take us through the international regulation of nuclear energy. So before we start, I would like our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I'll start with Ms. Imena. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. So it's very nice. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's going to be very interesting. And I'm going to be very happy to introduce you to what nuclear liability is. Nuclear law is a very large domain, so we're going to focus on one of them, which is nuclear liability. So I'm the head of the Office of Legal Counsel of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, and I've been working there now for 9 years. And this topic of nuclear liability is one of our major, as you will see. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Susan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Victoria, Mr. Jeremy, Ms. Jimena. Thank you very much for hosting me today. My name is Susan Nakanwaji. I am a lawyer by profession. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Dundee Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law, and Policy. But then I'm also the Assistant Executive Director of the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative, where I also work as the project manager for the Women in Energy and Mining Empowerment Program. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Susan. Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Victoria. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Odor. I recently graduated from the University of Dundee, where I studied international energy law and policy. In the same vein, I also undertook the summer program at University of Montpellier in close collaboration with the International School of Nuclear Law, hosted by the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency, where I also obtained a university diploma in international nuclear law. So today we'll briefly be discussing the role of nuclear energy in Africa, helping Africa improve its access to energy. And I'll briefly be talking about just a few policies that could support nuclear investments in Africa. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Jeremy, Imena, and Susan. So we shall start off our discussion with Ms. Susan Nakanwaji, who's going to briefly take us through the issue of energy access in Africa and how nuclear energy can play a role in tackling the energy access challenges we're facing on the continent. Thereafterwards, Ms. Imena will bring in the international perspective of nuclear energy regulation, focusing on the issue of liability. And also afterwards, Mr. Jeremy, as he has mentioned, he will take us through the policies for nuclear energy development or investments in Africa. So just a quick, I'll just take you through a few guidelines. As our presenters or panelists are making their presentations, feel free to engage them through the Q&A and send in your questions. They will actively be responding to all the questions. But however, at the end of the webinar, after all the presentations, we shall be able to actively take in questions from you, and then our panelists will be able to respond to the questions. And if you have noticed in the chat, I've sent you a link to our live stream on YouTube. So we are actively, we are live on YouTube. So do feel free to share the link with all your contacts so that they also get to know or learn more about nuclear energy. Ms. Susan, would you like to start your presentation?
Yes, Dr. Victoria, thank you very much. So today I'll be taking you through the nuclear energy in Africa, prospects, challenges, and safeguards. This also doubles as the title for my book chapter in the Energy Transition book, which Dr. Victoria is editing. So we have the overview of the nuclear energy, the global outlook of nuclear use in Africa. We have the pros and cons of nuclear energy and the key regulatory concerns. So nuclear energy is a form of energy produced by an atomic reaction capable of producing an alternative source of electrical power to that supplied by coal, gas, or oil. Now, this electricity is key for the economic development of any nation, of any state. This picture here just shows you the chain of reactions. So globally, we have over 50 countries utilizing nuclear energy with about 220 research reactors. So these reactors can be used in the medical profession, in the industry, and for training purposes. Today, nuclear is the world's second largest source of low carbon power, accounting for over 29% of the total by 2017. When we look at the next slide here, we realize that nuclear power provides about 10% of the total energy, but then coal and gas still take the first position, though it ranks higher than solar, wind, geothermal energy. So it's a very good idea for Africa to adopt nuclear energy. When you look here, you realize that West and Central Europe are leading, followed by North America here, where we have USA leading. In Europe, we have France leading in nuclear production. But then realize that Africa here ranks very, very low in Africa. So why do we have low nuclear? Why do we have low nuclear use in Africa? One, we have only 2 nuclear reactors in South Africa, which accounting for only 5% of its total electricity. However, in October 2019, South Africa outlined plans to build a 1 gigawatt of nuclear energy capacity by the year 2030. Several countries are considering nuclear generation. We have Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, Uganda, Morocco. All these are looking into using nuclear in their own grids. So there are several reasons as to why Africa is lagging behind in the use of nuclear energy. And the major one are the high capital costs required in nuclear installations. For example, installing a nuclear site producing 1,100 megawatts will require between 6 billion and 10 billion US dollars, which is quite high for any African country. We also have low human capital with institutional quality. The process of developing a robust legal and regulatory framework is very long and technical. And then the low nuclear technology capacity on the continent. Most of the technology being used is being sourced from the USA, is being sourced from China. So there is a loophole there where the Africans need to see which kind of technology really works for Africa. Nuclear energy has got a lot of advantages, especially in terms of providing clean, reliable, and cost-effective energy. It therefore acts as a double-edged sword for both access to energy and clean energy for the climate mitigation movement. In Africa, we have over 600 million people who lack access to energy. That's like half of the population in Africa do not have access to energy. And then we realize that having clean energy and mitigating climate change is also very productive when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, number 7, number 13 on climate action, the contributions in the Paris Agreement, and then about 145 countries have incorporated clean energy in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So we see that Africa could really make use of the nuclear energy. Also a direct contribution to other SDGs, health, industry, innovation, clean cities. Yeah, but then also nuclear energy has got its own detriments, or there are still shortfalls in nuclear energy. Why? Most people are considering it with caution. Things of waste disposal, nuclear produces a lot of solid, liquid, and gaseous waste. We have issues of spent fuel rods, how to dispose of them. Even after the fuel rods, the uranium, have been used, they still have to be kept in a very safe state. So the issues of decommissioning, what happens to these nuclear installations? How do you keep their spent fuel rods? Some of them take hundreds of years before they can be totally decommissioned. So Africa will have challenges there, and I hope the policymakers make good decisions regarding that to protect the environment. When there are nuclear accidents, this is another point. When there are nuclear accidents, the effects are devastating, from loss of lives, exposure to radioactive substances, injuring human health, the environment, the result of potential transboundary pollution and harm. And these accidents have actually been the drivers of many people and many states running away from the use of nuclear. For example, following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident of 2011 in Japan, Germany decided to stop producing nuclear by the year 2022. So Germany is phasing out nuclear production. So this is a tricky era for Africans. While some countries are running away from the use of nuclear, in Africa, we see it as a solution for our energy challenges. So how do we balance that too? How do we put up the safeguards for this? Okay. So yeah, this is very simple. So my presentation identifies the key regulatory concerns where Africans need to put more focus. And I know Ms. Jimena will come in and talk more on this, the liability and compensation for nuclear damage. We have the public and environmental protection, nuclear safety and emergency response, the non-proliferation and nuclear security, which includes control of nuclear weapons, protection of nuclear materials, terrorist activities. Like the world is now very skeptical in the use of nuclear. When you look at the USA's bombing of Hiroshima at the end of the World War II, people still remember these effects of nuclear. So how do you protect, as we are looking into producing nuclear energy, as we are looking into expanding our share of the nuclear, how would we ensure that people are protected, the environment is protected, this nuclear is not going to be used for terrorist activities, people are protected? Yeah, so there's a lot of key challenges there. There are some sources here we can all go and look at, from the International Energy Agency, the World Nuclear Association, a lot of statistics there. So this, I'll just leave you here with a map showing which rely more on nuclear energy. We have France here leading in Europe. We have the USA leading in North America, China leading in Asia, and then Africa. Sadly, we only have one country here, which is South Africa. So let's work together and increase nuclear energy. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, Victoria.
All right, thank you very much, Susan, for that presentation. Now, without wasting any time, I would invite Ms. Jimena to take us through the international regulation of nuclear energy. She has lots of expertise in the sector, so I'm sure you will learn a lot from her. And do not forget to share the link to our YouTube video with your contacts, and also do not forget to subscribe. Ms. Imena, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So thank you, Suzanne, for setting up the scene. As she mentioned, so one of the big questions and concerns when you're developing nuclear energy is liability and compensation. So what happens in case of an accident? It's true that, as she mentions, nuclear accidents can have detrimental damage to health, property, the environment, and economy, with eventually transboundary effects, which is one of the industrial activities that can have that. You can affect your neighboring countries. Well, in the history of nuclear, which now is nearly 60 years old, we have had three major accidents, I would say. The 3 Mile Island in the US in 1979, where in fact it was mainly damage on site. So people around the plant were just evacuated for a few days and came back to their home. And there was no afterwards damage to the environment there. There was some damage on site, but it was limited. Then it's true we had Chernobyl in 1986, which was the major accident which had transboundary effects. So that showed the extent of damage that it could cause to the environment and the health and the property. And then we had Fukushima in 2011, which was localized, let's say, around the nuclear power plant in Japan, by where you had thousands of people who were evacuated. A good thing, in a certain sense, that we could say, is that there was no casualties, direct casualties in the public. So due to the Fukushima accident, but there was a lot of environmental damage there, and also property loss because people couldn't go back to their house. However, nuclear, now we're talking about developing clean energy. It does bring a lot of significant benefits, such as a very high production of electricity. One shouldn't forget that nuclear also helps in medical diagnosis for industrial and agricultural uses too. Energy is one of them. So how have the government responded? Because one of the questions, especially when nuclear was launched, and again, Susan was saying, everybody had the idea of the bomb in mind. However, as the accidents that I just mentioned demonstrated, an accident, nuclear accident, doesn't have the same effect as a bomb, as those bombs. But however, it is a technology which can cause quite a lot of damage. So in order to be able to develop this activity, the government had to come up with a response that would balance, in fact, the interests of the different stakeholders. Of course, they had to ensure an adequate compensation for damage for the victims. And also they should also protect nuclear plant investors and suppliers in a certain way, because otherwise nobody would go into that business if they could be sued and they could have ruinous liability claims. So one thing is that they adopted a special liability and compensation regime at a national, but also international levels, because the ordinary common law is not well suited to deal with this particular problem in the nuclear field. And we will see that a little bit later on. So this is a delicate balance of interests here that we had to deal with. So what do these regimes cover, in fact? So as I mentioned, there are exceptional regimes. So normal tort law that you all know well when you suffer some damage is not enough to cover risks of this magnitude. And also because of the technology itself, which is very complicated. I come from the project finance field, and when you're constructing a nuclear power plant, you have thousands of suppliers. So it's difficult also to prove who was faulty and which was a defective equipment or what exactly can happen. So you can spend years before trying to know who is responsible for an accident. And that is not for the benefit of the victims, having to wait for so long. So whenever also risks are associated with nuclear activities can properly be dealt with through existing legal processes, they are left outside the scope of these special regimes. For example, for radioisotopes that you use for medical research or also for cancer treatments. The damage that they can cause is quite limited. So they're excluded from this special regime, and insurance can cover with no problem. You have medical insurance for that. Hospitals all have insurance in case of an accident. So the special regimes apply only to nuclear damage, caused by a nuclear incident occurring at a nuclear installation or in the course of transport of nuclear substances. Those terms who are there in red are all strictly defined in the conventions I'm going to talk about. So that's why I have highlighted them. Of course, the international conventions I'm going to introduce you to provides for the basic regimes applicable, and states remain free to take any additional measures they consider is necessary to protect their nationals. So these conventions, they provide in fact for these liability basic principles, which are the basis of nuclear liability regime, of this special regime. One is, and that's the most important one, is that the operator is strictly and exclusively liable. What does it mean? Strictly liable. It means that the victims do not need to prove fault or negligence, but they will only have to prove the causal link. For example, when the Fukushima accident occurred, the operator of the nuclear power plant, which name is TEPCO, was the one who got sued by the victims. It was the only entity who was responsible for the accident. And the victims only need to prove that the nuclear damage they had suffered, and that's it. So they didn't need to look and to prove that there was fault from TEPCO's side. Exclusive liability, it means that it's going to be the only entity liable and no one else is going to be liable. Even the suppliers, even if it's maybe an equipment default, it's going to be the operator. Now, this is also important because it has the capacity of channeling all the financial insurance that they can get in the market, to have only one person to bear the liability and to be obliged to have insurance. So it's important on a financial aspect. The other thing which is important is that no other law than the nuclear liability law will apply in order to compensate victims for nuclear damage. So it's only to compensate for nuclear damage. So if you want to sue somebody for other reasons than nuclear damage, of course, you can have other laws that would apply. Then we have the operator's liability in amount. This is a big discussion because in fact, at the beginning, the nuclear liability regimes provided for a maximum amount. Now that's not the case anymore. And even you have a few countries that have provided for unlimited liability, like Germany, Japan, and Switzerland. So the conventions now provide for minimum amounts that have to be set in the national legislation. One important thing when talking about an industrial activity is that the operator has to have insurance. It's extremely important in order to ensure that if an accident occurs, there will be liquidity, there will be money available to start paying the victims. So now, how the financial security is covered, there are different options that I will not get into here, but one of the most important of them is of course, insurance. Then you have liability limited in time. So the conventions at the beginning, they provided for a prescription period of 10 years from the date of the accident. However, after Chernobyl, one saw the effects on the human body. So it has been extended for 30 years, but only for bodily injury. So people would have now 30 years to claim compensations. Now, one thing which is very important is that, as we saw and discussed at the beginning, nuclear can have transboundary damage. So as lawyers, we know that one of the main topics when you have international issues, so international disputes, is you can spend years trying to decide which is the competent court and which is the applicable law. So being a party to a convention and having your neighboring countries also parties to the same convention will help you in fact to decide and not to get into the discussion about which is the competent court and which is the applicable law. So in principle, the competent court is the one where the nuclear power plant, where the accident occurred, was situated. So let's say that's the principle. And also the courts will have to apply the relevant convention, the convention its country ratified, and also the national law, the substantive and procedural matters. There's another also important principles in case of transboundary damage is that there is non-discrimination among the victims. Of course, these two principles will only apply in case that both countries are parties to the same convention. There has to be a treaty relationship between the states. So what are these regimes? One, and that's the one that my organization, in fact, provides assistance to, is the Paris Convention on Nuclear Third-Party Liability. So it was the first one to be adopted. So originally, this convention was only open to OECD countries, which at the time in 1950s, it was mainly European countries. But now, in fact, it's open to other countries. For example, we have one of the parties is, for example, Turkey. In addition to that, you have the Brussels Supplementary Convention that was adopted very quickly, but this convention is very special. As mentioned in my slide, it's a supplementary funding instrument, meaning that the parties that have adhered to this one will put more money if there is an accident that occurs in their own country. So it's a pot of money that all the countries, parties to the Brussels, will have access to in case of an accident. These conventions were in fact improved in 2004 after Chernobyl, but these protocols to amend them has not yet entered into force. Then we have the Vienna Convention, which is the other convention that was adopted at this very little time after the Paris one for the rest of the world. You know, as I mentioned, the Paris one at the beginning was mainly for European countries. Vienna Convention was for the other countries. It is under the IAEA auspices. After Chernobyl, it was also improved. So we have the 1997 protocol amending the Vienna Convention. And finally, we have a third regime, which is a convention supplementary compensation for nuclear damage. This convention was adopted after Chernobyl and entered into force quite recently. Is the most newest one. And in fact, this one combines the conventions that provide for the principles I just mentioned, and also has an additional international fund. So it provides more money also in case there is an accident in one of the countries parties to this convention. Now, after Chernobyl, we had two conventions. We had Paris from one side, we had Vienna from the other side. And it's true that when Chernobyl occurred, people said, what would happen if there was an accident in a Paris Convention country with damage in a Vienna Convention country? How would that work? So in fact, this joint protocol was adopted just after Chernobyl in order to erect a bridge between the two, meaning that if there is an accident in a Paris Convention country with damage in a Vienna Convention country, then this protocol will tell you which convention will apply, and will be, in fact, the convention where the nuclear accident occurred. So here is for you the amounts that are provided under the different conventions. I thank Victoria that she told me that you're going to have access to the slides, so they're going to be shared. Now, so this is for you as to remember. They have three big phases in the evolution of nuclear liability regimes. The first phase is development. The second phase was Chernobyl, big accident. We saw the damage it can cause, so we improved all the conventions. And the third phase was Fukushima. So what have we learned? One is that relying on basic international law to define, for example, what is applicable law in competent courts, you don't have time to think. I mean, when you have thousands of people who are evacuated and you have damage in another country, things need to go extremely quickly. We need also to prepare ourselves. So we usually talk about emergency preparedness and response. We should do the same with regard to the legal aspects. So it's very important that everybody be prepared to know what to do in case of an accident. Then there is no time to start enacting basic laws. So you have to have your legislation in place way before even thinking of any accident. I mean, of course, safety first always, but you should have, if you're developing a nuclear energy program, you have to have the nuclear liability legislation in place. And also, most important of all, you have to have treaty relations with your neighboring countries so that if there is damage caused to one of your neighboring countries, you will know how that will work. Nuclear is also important for three other actors. One is public acceptance. People will ask you, I mean, how am I going to get compensated? How is it going to work if there's an accident? The operators, the investors and the suppliers, they will want to get into a business that will be profitable for them and where they will be in a certain way protected of readiness claims. And the insurance is an extremely important part of nuclear liability because you need to have the operator duly insured to be able to then compensate the victims. It's always about the victims afterwards. But the nuclear insurers need to know exactly how they're going to compensate, so they need to have a harmonized legislation there. So how to have treaty relations with your neighboring countries, I had just explained to you there are so many conventions, in fact, on nuclear liability. So these are the different options that you can have. But I would say that the most important one, if you want to have treaty relations with everybody, with the suppliers and with your neighboring countries, it is to adhere to the revised Vienna Convention, which is the Vienna Convention post-Chernobyl, with a joint protocol, because then you have links with the Paris Convention countries. But also you can adhere to the newest convention, the CSC, in order to have treaty relations with countries such as, for example, the United States. They are parties to the CSC. There are two countries who have done that. It's Romania and the UAE, who have joined the revised Vienna, the joint protocol, the CSC, and they have therefore treaty relations with all the countries, whether neighboring countries or also suppliers and investors. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't been too long.
All right, thank you very much, Emena. Without wasting any time, I would like Mr. Jeremy to also start on his presentation. And I see lots of questions have been addressed to Susan and Emena. Please kindly start addressing some of those questions. Mr. Jeremy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So policies to support nuclear power investments in Africa. Just by way of introduction, we would all agree that energy is the backbone to any strong development in any country, but we know there are various sources of energy such as hydro, thermal, fossil fuels, and local gas. But some of these sources are dwindling, and there have also been several research that say some of the sources would run out at some point, some say 2030, and we all know one of the major problems with fossil fuels, which is the price volatilities. So basically, nuclear power is the largest source of low carbon electricity in most advanced economies. It makes an important contribution to energy security in all those countries as well. So in moving forward, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, provided guidance to countries who want to embark on a nuclear power plant for the first time. So it designed the milestone development for countries who want to build a national infrastructure for nuclear. And we'll just briefly run through it to give you a background of the policies we're about to discuss. So basically, the IAEA introduced the activities needed to prepare the infrastructure for nuclear power. And these activities can be split into 3 phases, with the duration of it dependent on the degree of commitment of the resources applied in the country. So basically, the term infrastructure milestone is used to identify the point at which the activities required in that phase of development have been successfully completed. So basically, each infrastructure milestone corresponds with the completion of a set of activities with no implication about the speed to which it is reached. So these are the first 3 phases every country must pass, and each of these 3 phases are marked with a milestone. So phase 1, a country must consider before a decision to launch a nuclear power program is taken. Phase 2, it must begin to prepare work for contracting, construction of a nuclear power plant. And at the phase 3, it must implement activities to start running the first nuclear power plant. So these are the 3 milestones. So for phase 1, let me just take you to this diagram. So for phase 1, the country must be, the milestone to complete phase 1 for each country is the country must be ready to make a knowledgeable commitment to power. So this could be in form of setting up the necessary regulations, setting up the regulatory body that would oversee nuclear power regulations. at the phase 2, it must be ready to invite bids to negotiate. So this is where you have, depending on how the government chooses to invite investors, it could be it could be power purchase agreements, it could be bids, it could be whichever form the government decides. And phase 3 is when the country is ready to commission the first plant. So there are different regulations, there are different guidelines a country must fulfill in this phase 3 before it can start running a nuclear power plant. So basically, Nigeria is trying to develop a nuclear power plant. In 2017, it was at the phase 2, where it signed an agreement with the Russian company Rosatom to build 2 nuclear power plants in East Nigeria. So moving forward, the policies to support nuclear development, these policies are specifically targeted in Africa based on our electricity markets and grid capacity. So certain policies should be in place to ensure that nuclear is able to compete on a level playing field and address barriers to investments in lifetime extensions and building new capacity. However, amongst so many challenges for developing, African countries have faced majorly financing and, as I said, our electricity grid capacity. So basically, financing a nuclear plant is highly cost intensive. Without proper financing, nuclear is not an option. Most African countries will find this very difficult to invest huge amounts of money in a nuclear power project. Based on the high upfront cost of constructing a nuclear plant cast out on private sector involvement in most African countries. And as I said, without proper reform of our electricity market and surrounding policies and infrastructure, most African governments will be the sole owners and operators of nuclear plants. However, there are other financing mechanisms, like for instance, we have export agencies of vendor countries, where these export agencies could offer to fund the nuclear plants. This would make lots of sense for many African countries, considering the financial incompetence. So an example of this mechanism is, just as I mentioned, in the phase 2 construction stage, and I gave the example of Nigeria, is the BOOT, Build, Own and Operate mechanism. So this mechanism, the International Export Agency of the vendor could come in and decide to build the plant, own it, operate it, make profit, and at some point transfers it back to the state government. So in adopting this sort of mechanism, the government may need to implement certain investment incentives, such as long-term price guarantees to encourage investors. Any investor who would choose this mechanism would be particular about recouping cost of capital with a reasonable interest margin as well. So they would want to know that, okay, if I'm building this power plant over these years, prices will be stable, and this is what I could recoup over this amount of years. So basically, long-term price guarantee, this is a measure to eliminate the unpredictability of cash flows inherent in wholesale electricity market. It can take the form of conventional power purchase agreement, as I mentioned. And this approach has been used in Turkey in the Akuyu plant. Another option is also the CFD, which is the contract for difference, which is essentially a swap between an agreed fixed price and wholesale market. This is a way future revenues are guaranteed for nuclear plants. An example of a country that implements this is the UK in its Hinkley Point C reactor. In both cases, the wholesale market the risk is transferred to the government entity, and the financial liability of the off-taker is potentially large. I mentioned another major problem African countries have in implementing a nuclear power plant is the national electricity grid. The size and configuration of the national power grid is essential to implementation. According to the IAEA, a single plant should consist of no more than 5 to 10% of total installed generating capacity of a national grid. So this, for example, if a country should have 10,000 megawatts already in place in its national grid, in place to generate 1,000 megawatts it should have at least 1,000 megawatts from nuclear power. And we know most nuclear power plants are effectively run as base load generators, and this requires constant demand in the market. So few African countries, as we all know, currently have a grid of this capacity to accommodate large nuclear plants. The grid would need to be increased to accommodate large units, or alternatively, other small nuclear power plant options, such as the small modular reactors, would be explored. Small modular reactors produce electricity power like up to 300 megawatts per unit, or all around half of the traditional reactor. And their major components can be manufactured in a factory setting and transported. So you don't need to, it could be built in the vendor country and shipped over to the national, to the receiving country. You don't need to start the construction from scratch at the receiving country, basically. So why small modular reactors are expected to begin commercial operation in Argentina, China, and Russia between 2018 and 20, African countries are still wary of such projects due to its novelty. So basically, the small modular reactors have not been commercially viable yet. It has not been tested. It has not been, there's no track record of it. So, so many African countries would be really skeptical about investing in an unproven project yet. But another option could also be another option for expanding our grid could be joining a regional grid. For example, we have the West African Pool, which was created to integrate national power systems within the ECOWAS region in a unified national regional electricity market. In concluding this, we must realize that going nuclear is not something that happens from day one to the next. From the moment a country initiates a nuclear power program until the first unit becomes operative, years would pass. Creating the necessary nuclear infrastructure and building the first power will take at least 10 to 15 years. So basically, a successful nuclear power program requires a broad political and popular support and a national commitment of at least 100 years. And this includes committing to the entire life cycle of a power plant, from construction through electricity generation and finally decommissioning. Aside time, there's also the issue of cost, which is a major factor to African governments. Governments and private operators need to make a considerable investment that includes projected waste management and decommissioning costs. And I will add also nuclear liability cost as well. Regarding the fear of future accidents, safety and security are major considerations for African countries, and the IAEA's milestone approach I previously mentioned has taken this into large consideration. This is a phased method created to assist countries that are assessing their readiness to embark on nuclear power program. This IAEA milestone approach helps them to consider different aspects such as the legal framework, the nuclear safety, security, radiation protection, environmental protection, and radioactive waste management. In summary, Africa is hungry for energy based on its growing populations, and nuclear power could be an answer for an increasing number of countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Now I call upon Professor Volker Ruben, who's also with us here, to moderate the session for Q&A. And I've seen Susan and Imena, you've been trying to address most of the questions that have been raised. So Professor Volker, would you like to take over? We can do this jointly.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic presentations we have had, and it has really been pointed out how important this is potentially for Africa under a clear legal regime of liability. So I think there's a number. I mean, there's a long range of questions. So obviously people want to have the slides shared. That's not an issue, is it, Victoria?
No, it's not an issue. I sent to most of the people the slides before the webinar started. But if you haven't yet got the slides, please feel free to email me. I'm sure most of you have my email address. Then I'll share the slides, but I had already shared the slides with most of the people.
There is one specific email here or comment from Collins, I think, who runs a campaign in Kenya called Nuclear Energy, and is the better partner to reach out to stakeholders and the public to promote nuclear energy. Has anyone heard of this, or wants to engage with this particular campaign of the presenters? Maybe Jeremy, have you heard of this?
Yeah. Sorry, I really didn't understand. Engage in.
It's called campaign in Kenya called Nuclear Energy is the better partner.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I would probably if the sender could just put his email address, I would have a personal chat with him after this webinar, if he would.
Okay.
All right. As Professor is looking through another question, there's one question here addressed to Jeremy. They're asking in what ways and during what phase should the government start implementing strategies for technological transfers from the foreign contractors of the nuclear to its nationals? So Jeremy, you can prepare to address that. And then I think Imena, you can address a question from Collins Waffler, who's asking, the nuclear project is costly. Capital costs will entangle the African countries into more and more debts. How effective will the states ensure that consumers enjoy nuclear without feeling the burden? So Imena, you can try to address that question with respect to the costs of nuclear energy. Professor Volker will be bringing in more questions. So Jeremy, do you want to start by addressing the question addressed to you?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Victoria, and who asked the question. So basically, as I mentioned, there are different phases to the nuclear development. But at the phase one, the government would have implemented several institutions, for example, like the R&D institutions, maybe with its universities for technology transfer, obviously. It could have had a regulatory agency, and as well as other maybe local content laws as well that would facilitate technological transfers. So technology transfers, I think it could go hand in hand when the operations of the nuclear plant has kicked off, obviously. And maybe it just depends on what the government intends to do. This could, the foreign operator, if it's a BOOT, could operate the nuclear power plant in collaboration with the country's R&D, research and development, or maybe a university, as in the case of Nigeria, where we have a research institute for nuclear law with the Ahmadu Bello University. And that's like the research and development for nuclear law. So the country could decide that, okay, as the operator, goes ahead to manage the plant, it must collaborate with its researchers so that they could, learn these things. And that's viable enough. So the implementing strategies you're talking about, this could all be negotiated in the power purchase agreement, or maybe joint venture. It just depends on whatever contractual agreement the parties have, and the government could just simply say, so you would operate this in collaboration with our research team or university, so that they could learn about the technology and continue after the operator would have transferred it back to the country. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Before Imena addresses her question, Susan will see a question that is addressed to you. They want you to talk more on the issue of nuclear safety and government preparedness in Africa. So Imena, address your question, and then Susan come in with the issue of nuclear safety and how African countries are prepared to develop nuclear energy. Then Professor Volker will be able to raise other questions. Imena?
Yes, thank you. So yes, the cost of nuclear energy, it's a big issue. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so it would be my other colleagues working on nuclear technology department who have that answer. However, from my project finance experience, I can give a beginning of an answer. Well, one of the big things that has refrained nuclear from expanding is the fact that it's not considered a clean energy because of the waste issue. And therefore, international funding organizations like the World Bank, for example, do not provide, it's true, loans for the time being for countries to develop. And that's a big issue. I mean, before working in the nuclear sector, I used to work in the water sector, where it was very different. And it's true that there you can find a lot of funding for infrastructure projects, but it's not the case for nuclear. So therefore, as you cannot have multilateral organizations providing funding to governments, then you have to try to see how to attract private sector. But then the private sector is a little bit sensitive because of, it's true, it's an industry which, again, I wouldn't consider, it is a dangerous activity. We talked about the accidents. However, as you could see, why I'm still working in nuclear is because when I started working in nuclear, I could see how safety always came first, how there was a huge safety culture in the industry. And again, I mean, 60 years have gone by. I don't say that it has been no accidents. We have 2 major accidents, but well, still, I mean, everybody focuses on nuclear safety. But however, it has a very bad image, especially in the public. So people are afraid of financing projects. And it's true that there is a problem. Because then the only solution you would have as a state would then fully finance that. But again, not all the states have the money to be able to finance such huge infrastructure projects. But then there is one project that has been developed under what we call the build, operate, and transfer principle, which is in Turkey, where in fact you have the Russian, the Russian state nuclear organization, Rosatom, who is constructing, because it's not yet finished, is constructing a nuclear power plant in Turkey under the build, operate, and transfer. What does that mean? Is that they're bringing the money, they're building the nuclear power plant, and they're going to get paid afterwards with the fees they will get by selling the electricity. And after a several number of years, here we're talking about 20 or more years, I don't have the details of the contract in mind, they will transfer the nuclear power plant to the Turkish government. So that is one approach that could take place, but again, not everybody can bring also such financing to construct a nuclear power plant, but that has been one of the solutions. But one of the things is that given the current situation with the combating climate change today, there are a lot of discussions going on with the World Bank in order to try to have them change their mind with regard to nuclear, but it's not done yet.
All right, thank you very much, Imena. So before Susan addresses her question, Professor Volker, do you have some questions to raise to Jeremy so that he can prepare as Susan is addressing her question?
Yeah, I think if I can summarize it, I think these are more comments, but they seem to understand. The question seems to be, what do you think needs to be the regulatory and legal readiness for nuclear power investments? I think this came up. So maybe effectively, what regulatory and legal framework has to be put in place in countries that want to go down that route?
All right, and then for Imena, I think you can address a question from Ivan, who's asking, who's saying that he recommended the Vienna rather than the Paris protocol in a pure comparative context. What makes one protocol better than the other? So as you're preparing for that, Susan, would you like to address your question? I think you're on mute, Susan.
Yeah, Victoria, can you please repeat the question? I can't find it here.
Oh,
I I think this is.
Your question with respect to safety, how can African countries prepare to, with respect to develop nuclear energy, and also take into consideration the safety measures?
Okay, thank you very much. When talking about safety, we are looking at things like the environmental harm. We are looking at things like the impacts of the accidents. What happens when there's an accident? The human health is impacted, the environment is impacted, the economy is impacted. I also address issues of the security. Apart from the safety, there are also issues of security. For example, when you look at the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1968, it's aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices or control over such weapons, such that they're only used for peaceful uses. So I think what the governments can do is to take leverage of the international conventions. How can they leverage their own laws, taking into account the international standards set by the IAEA, set by the International Energy Agency, International Nuclear Atomic Agency? So how do we leverage our own laws? How would we benefit from them? How do we connect our local laws to that? On issues of safety, we have to educate the masses. We have to, that's through stakeholder engagement, education, how to keep safe. And also, if we have the right technology in place, I think we can really benefit from the nuclear energy. Thank you.
Can I just maybe follow up with a question of my own, and that refers to a discussion Jemina and I had at the beginning. You mentioned environmental impact assessments, right, being mandated by the European Court of Justice. Can you say a few words about the importance of environmental impact assessments?
Yes, of course. One of those big things, and because of again the transboundary potential damages that nuclear can have, there has been a lot of concerns, especially mainly in Europe. I mean, Africa is a very big continent. Your countries are very big. Europe, everything is very small and shrink. So when you have a nuclear accident, it will be definitely very quickly go on the other side of the border. So the risk is major in Europe. But there is a convention which is called the ESPO Convention, which is a Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment, International Environmental Impact Assessment, that in fact requires that for any industrial activity, so it's not only focusing on nuclear, it's any industrial activity that could have a transboundary impact, there should be an international environmental impact assessment. So you should ask your neighboring countries for comments. And in case somebody's developing one of those industrial activities in your country. Now that ESPO convention has also been implemented in the European legislation. So all the European countries are also parties to that ESPO convention. And so there has been lately a decision of the European Court of Justice that has decided in Belgium, they decided to extend the lifetime of one of their nuclear power plants. It was even a decision that was taken by law, but they had not done an environmental impact assessment before taking the decision. And so neighboring countries complained because they wanted to have a say. And the European Court of Justice reminded them that they had to do an environmental impact assessment, even if you want to only extend or do some works in a nuclear power plant, because it could potentially have consequences for neighboring countries. So this is a big issue, and it's true that it's something, the public is becoming more and more aware and involved in these kinds of decisions. So it's true that now international impact environmental assessments are a big deal, especially in Europe for the time being.
Great.
All right. Thank you very much.
And maybe if I can answer the other question, because I think it's a good question and I want to clarify.
All right,
Victoria.
we are left with a few minutes to address the questions.
All right, so no, it's about recommending one or the other. In fact, when you look at the nuclear liability conventions, they all provide for the same principles. And even I would say that the Paris Convention provides, you know, I told you that there was a threshold, a minimum amount in all the conventions on the liability amounts. The Paris one provides for the highest one. So I would say that the Paris is quite protective in that sense. However, I said that in Africa, potentially you could see at the Vienna, because when you take a decision of which convention you want to ratify, you have to look at your neighbors, because the important thing, and what accents have demonstrated until now, is that if there is transboundary damage, it's going to be quite localized. I mean, it's not going to be on the other side of the world. So you have to see on a regional level which conventions your neighbors have ratified. But however, I said ratify, I would suggest to ratify the Vienna Convention, its modern form. And I also said the joint protocol. The joint protocol is, as I mentioned, you know, the bridge between Paris and Vienna, so that you will have a treaty relations with the Paris Convention too. For example, if you buy equipment from a Paris Convention country, so they will know that you're applying the same principles as they are. You see, voilà. I hope I answered the question.
All right, thank you, Emena. Jeremy, would you like to address your question? We're just left with a few minutes to end our webinar. And then for the closing remarks, I would also invite one of our students who has been really very enthusiastic with our webinars, just to say a word of thanks, and that's Deng. So Deng, you can prepare yourself. Jeremy, please do address your...
There are a couple of questions here for me, but I don't know if it's this one that is talking about how can nuclear help in energy security. I don't know. There are just lots of questions here, but maybe I could just address.
You can summarize and summarize the questions and also the answers.
Okay, so yeah, about energy security, basically, we know apart from the cost and the pros and cons, but nuclear energy actually develops, it has a high capacity, and it actually generates up to 70% of its capacity, unlike renewables with the intermittency issues and fossil fuel with, you know, the diverse volatility of prices. But, you know, nuclear power, for instance, France, right? France generates majority of its energy with nuclear power, and it has been actually able to ensure energy security. And it also helps in balancing the common electricity market, the European common electricity market. So France also contributes because France has more stable energy. Nuclear energy is actually more stable, and France helps to balance, you know, the international grid. So this will tell you that nuclear energy is personally is the most viable option for energy security, because it has a high capacity and it has a high generating capacity as well. If I would look at another question to quickly summarize, just a couple here. Between energy. Yeah, in what ways the nuclear implementing strategies? This has been answered. Okay, so someone said during what phase of commissioning do nuclear plants, the government establish net present value and the commissioning cost associated with nuclear plant? What I'll say here is the commissioning costs. The commissioning cost would come, basically, you can't really begin to ascertain what the commissioning cost would be at the onset of developing a nuclear plant, because most nuclear plants also get lifetime extension. So from 60 years, most countries have regulations that allow most nuclear plants to extend operation with like additional 20, 25 years basically. But what I feel is a decommissioning fund could be in place But for you to value what the decommissioning liability would be at the onset of the operation of a nuclear plant, I don't think that would be wise for a government to consider at the stage of development. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but feel free to engage our panelists on LinkedIn and also other social media forms. So we shall have our concluding remarks, starting with Susan, just 2 minutes to do your concluding remarks, and then Imena, Jeremy, and then also our special guest or moderator, Professor Volker Robin, will make the concluding remarks. And then we shall have Mr. Deng from CPMLP, who's also from South Sudan, and he has been following all our webinars to say a word of thanks to our panelists. And then that will be the end of the webinar. Do not forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We shall be bringing you more discussions on energy and mining. Susan, 2 minutes for your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everyone who's online. Thank you, the panelists. This was a very good discussion, very engaging. Yes, and my concluding remarks are that Africa actually do need nuclear energy for its economic development. We cannot afford to miss out on the benefits of having nuclear energy for access to electricity, cleaner forms of energy that's in climate change mitigation. However, most people are very skeptical about the use of nuclear energy. And that's one hurdle governments will have to overcome. How do we make the people fall in love with nuclear energy? Because if the public is against nuclear energy, for example, in Germany, they voted against nuclear energy in their state and they're phasing it out completely. So how do we ensure that the Africans embrace nuclear energy? One, through meaningful engagement, multi-stakeholder engagement. We should have all people on board. Let's make the people feel that nuclear is safe for them. That's through getting the social license to operate, benchmarking our laws and regulations. And I think when we do all that, getting the right technologies, securing the right funds, we shall have a very successful nuclear industry in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Imena, 2 minutes for your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you. Well, I will not insist on the fact that you have, if you're thinking about developing nuclear energy, you have definitely to work on the nuclear liability and compensation regime, which is extremely important. So Suzanne was saying how to potentially convince stakeholders about developing energy. Well, this is not the solution, it's part of the solution, trying to bring them and to explain to them how nuclear liability will work and that you're prepared. We have been working at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency on preparing the countries. We're doing several workshops on how to prepare for nuclear liability and, for example, how to define nuclear damage when you have suffered an accident. Because again, when you have an accident, you don't have time to think. Everything has to be ready before, as much as possible. Of course, some things you cannot do it in advance, but all that you can, you should. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Imena. Jeremy, please, your concluding remarks. And by the way, a special thanks to Jeremy for introducing us to Imena. This has been a very fruitful discussion. Jeremy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Victoria. The pleasure is mine. I would just say nuclear energy is the most efficient source of low carbon technology. It has the highest capacity factor. Nuclear energy produces at least 93% of energy in a year. And I believe with Africa's growing energy needs and growing populations and ambitions to become industrialized, because without solving the energy problem in Africa, it's going to take a really, really long time for Africa to fully industrialize. And I feel solving the energy crisis in Africa is like 70% of solving our problems, basically. Because how can you attract manufacturing industries and industries, international industries to invest if you still have energy crisis? And basically, nuclear energy personally is the most efficient and reliable source of energy. Although so many environmentalists has been against nuclear due to safety reasons and difficulty in operations, but I believe these difficulties could be managed. The IAEA has been assisting countries to envisage these difficulties and challenges, and it works closely with these countries to understand what these issues are and help solve. So I would say, as a closing remark, in the wake of climate change and the need for Africa to vamp up its energy security, I would encourage our researchers and policymakers to begin to take nuclear options seriously. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeremy. Now we shall have our dear Professor Volker. He is a very busy professor, but today he made time to join us in this webinar. Professor Volker will give the concluding remarks, and then we shall have Denk give a word of thanks. But I also have to mention that Professor Volker is going to work closely with IMENA to ensure that the people at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy get more knowledge about nuclear energy. So definitely you want to know more about nuclear energy at the center, contact Professor Volker, because he's going to move that discussion forward. Professor Volker, your concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you, Victoria, for hosting this and running it so effectively. It's incredibly important, and our students are truly having a unique chance there. I think the legal counsel made very clear how important in this case international law really is, and a good and clear understanding of how it works. It's very far advanced, and the countries need to be very much aware of how these systems interacted to conventions, the joint protocol. Absolutely fascinating from international law point of view. I envy you for being able to work in such a practical and so well-functioning area. From wearing my researcher's hat, I think I was intrigued to think about the environmental impact side of it and how this could be developed, but this might be for another conversation. And then to our two students, actually 3 students, well done, and keep engaging in this work. And Jeremy, I hope you have more time to press the case now while you're at the UNFCCC Secretariat, and make the connection between clean energy and nuclear. Thank you very much, Victoria. That would be my concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Volker, and thank you very much for all your support. Denk, could you please just say a word of thanks to our panelists, especially Ms. Imena from the Nuclear Energy Agency?
Hello, everybody. My name is Denk. I'm from South Sudan, and I'm also a student here. I learned a lot today, and I'm really happy to see our student, my peers, my colleagues talking about nuclear. I had a chance to go to a nuclear plant, and it was so big. And listening to all of you here, I've read a lot about the nuclear accident 2 years ago from Japan. It was really crazy. And Susan talking about it, yes, for the interest of the local communities, and whether the African are ready for it today, and Jeremy is pushing for it. Wonderful. I learned a lot. And of course, my professor here, I think he wants to hear what happened today. We made it. We made it for upgrade, and that's why I came late. I think he wanted to hear from me that whether I made it or not. I just want to let you know, yes, I'm upgraded, and I really appreciate your support. And to my peers too, invite me if there's something that you're doing and you want me to support you, whatever you need, I am here. And let's keep going ahead and maybe support African, bring in energy, whether it's solar energy or whatever energy, so long as it's not going to impact the local communities, I am okay with that.
All right, thank you very much, Denk. And thank you very much, our panelists. Thank you very much, the participants. This marks the end of our webinar, but you can still watch the video on YouTube, and do not forget to share the link with all your contacts. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.